listener production. Hello, Sacha Barbour Gatt with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Have you ever considered what it takes to become an Australian citizen? If you're someone who was born in Australia and have spent your life here, you might not be aware of what a long, complicated and difficult journey it can be.
The hardest part is getting that Australian visa, the permanent residency visa or the temporary resident visa when you're not in Australia, when you're from a third world country particularly.
Australia Day is one of the biggest days of the year for citizenship ceremonies, and many councils are choosing to scrap these amid the conversation to change the date. But for the migrants who are finally becoming official citizens, the choice to receive that honour on January 26 isn't necessarily complicated. So for those who have gone through it, what did getting citizenship mean to them and how do they feel about it now? In the second half of this episode, we explore those ideas with comedian and journalist Sami Shah, who spent years going through the process of becoming an Australian citizen. First though, it is time for the headlines, which today come to you thanks to our friends in the Listener Newsroom. It is Monday, January 27.
Morning, it's Madeline Larson here, starting with sport, and Jannik Sinner has gone back-to-back at the Australian Open. The Italian wiping the floor with Germany's Alexander Zverev overnight in straight sets. While newly crowned Australian of the Year and AFL great Neil Daniher was a special guest at the men's singles, receiving a standing ovation as he entered the court at Rod Laver Arena.
We're also very proud to have in the arena tonight the 2025 Australian of the Year, Neil Daniher AO. Please, welcome Neil.
On 9 there. Meantime, in the women's doubles final, there was a trophy mix-up. The losing pair handed the memento for winning coaches instead of the runners-up plates. To other news, millions across the globe will pause today to reflect on the horror of the Holocaust, where over 6 million Jews were killed in Nazi Germany. The Foreign Minister will attend a ceremony in Germany later today, while PM Anthony Albanese says the world must never forget.
We will remember and honour all those who were murdered during World War II.
Extreme heat for Australia's southeast. Victoria is in the firing line today, with Melbourne reaching a top of 41, while Mildura will soar up to 44. There are also low to severe heat waves for New South Wales. Sydney hotter tomorrow, getting to the mid-30s. And a key ally of Donald Trump, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, has slammed the US president for pardoning violent Jan 6 rioters. Returning to the Oz Open, Jannik Sinner has been humbled by comparisons to Novak Djokovic following back-to-back titles. The Italian claiming a 6-3, 7-6, 6-3 win over Alexander Zverev overnight, the two-time champ crediting his support network for the win.
I have my team and the people who are close to me who trust me, and then that for me is even more important because I can talk with them very openly with them.
And there's all to play for in the Big Bash final tonight. The Hobart Hurricanes getting set to face the Sydney Thunder. Taking a quick look at weather across the country, overcast for Brisbane and 30, partly cloudy on the Gold Coast getting up to 29, similar skies in Sydney, 31 the top. A possible storm for Canberra soaring to 35, a hot one for Melbourne getting up to 41 degrees, patchy showers in Hobart and 32, sunny for Adelaide today reaching 35 degrees, blue skies for Perth and 32.
As we mark the Australia Day public holiday, whether you're working, spending it at the beach or at a barbecue, attending a rally or just getting through some chores, we can't ignore the contentious nature of our national day. So while many argue about what today should be used for, celebration or mourning, many others will be granted their long-held wish of becoming an Australian citizen. How do they feel about the debate, given the difficult journey they've been on to attain citizenship? And what does it mean to them now they've achieved that goal, many years and tens of thousands of dollars later? On this Australia Day, we're bringing you the story of what it takes to become an Aussie citizen. Sami Shah is a writer, comedian and educator who came to Australia from Pakistan after his life was threatened while working as a journalist there. Sami has gone through the process of attaining citizenship and ended up falling out with a friend when he was invited to be given his certificate by then PM Malcolm Turnbull on Australia Day back in 2017. Sami, thanks so much for talking to us today. Tell us, before we get to the how, why you wanted to become an Australian citizen.
I mean, that's such a big question in and of itself. We migrated here because life in Pakistan had gotten challenging. I was, getting death threats and things because I was working there as a journalist at the time. So there was that side of like just getting away from Pakistan. Australia, I'll be very honest, wasn't our first port of call. Our hope was to qualify for immigration to the US or the UK because those just was seen as more vibrant places to be in terms of especially if you're a journalist. But my partner at the time had been to Australia previously. She loved it, and particularly Melbourne. So we migrated here because she had a familiarity with it. But once you do migrate, especially on a work visa or anything, the end goal is citizenship. Very few people are migrating here just to work. I mean, I suppose there are people from New Zealand, there are people from England who come here and then they stay here for 50 years and never change their citizenship. But I suppose that's kind of one of the privileges of being from a first world country, where it doesn't really matter which first world country. Whereas for us, it was third world country to first world country, which is a massive upgrade. I used to do this joke, and it's largely true. The Pakistani passport is less a passport, more a voucher for free rectal exams redeemable in airports around the world. And compare that to the Australian passport, where you can kind of just walk into any country and just be like, hi, I'm here now. And they take you and they appreciate you for that. So it was largely that kind of benefit that you want.
So from start to finish, and people might not understand, and please enlighten me, because I'm the first to admit that I don't know the intricacies of the process of getting a citizenship. But from what I understand, once you arrive, the first goal is permanent residency. And then once that's been established, citizenship becomes an option later down the track. How long does that process from arriving in Australia to citizenship roughly take, and how much does it cost?
How long it takes varies. So when we came here on a temporary resident visa, which then qualified us to apply for permanent residency after 2 years. You can apply after 2 years, but then they take another 2 years to process that. So it ends up being a 4 years on temporary resident. Then you end up on permanent resident. And then I think back when I did it, it used to be 4 years on permanent residence or 2 years on permanent residence, and then you qualify for citizenship. But then they take extra time to process that. Those wait times have blown out in the last few years. I know a lot of people now who they are permanent residents for 7 years, 8 years, up even 10 years sometimes, just before they even get the call for citizenship. So there is that side. And so I suppose the expense of it all is depending on your visas. The actual paperwork applications and things are several $100s each time, from TR to PR, PR to citizenship. So those expenses, we were both working. So, it wasn't something that hit us particularly hard. But yes, if you're a single income household or something, those prices can tend to add up, or those costs can add up as well. But yeah, the process, as far as I know now, is longer wait times because of Home Affairs and immigration departments having less staff to deal with the large influx of people. And then while you're on those wait times, that sense of insecurity, not knowing whether you'll ever qualify for citizenship or not, when the citizenship application will come through, and then the actual costs of applying for citizenship as well.
Was there anything in the process that surprised you?
The citizenship test was amusing, largely, I think, because there's a test you have to do. If you don't know, you can do a sample test online. They ask you things about Australia. And I think my problem was I had already been working as a journalist in Australia and was fairly well versed in Australian culture, society, history, legal issues, etc. by that point. So they'd ask you things like in the citizenship test, they'd say, Australia has freedom of speech, yes or no? And the correct answer is yes. Although technically, from my point of view, being more informed, I'm like, well, we don't have a Bill of Rights and it's not enshrined within the Bill of Rights because we don't have that. And even besides that, we've got issues with the defamation lawsuits, which actually stifle freedom of speech. In fact, you don't even protect it from satire as a satirist. So there is a lot of times when I'm like, I don't think we have freedom of speech. We have certain elements, but they don't want that kind of nuanced answer. So they just want a yes or a no thing. So that was a big shock to me when there's a lot of questions like that, which you're like, if you know too much, you might fail the citizenship exam. So you need to be more of a dumbass to pass the citizenship exam, which I think was a bit of a surprise.
Did you have a plan B of like, if this doesn't work, or if for some reason I'm knocked back along the way, like this is what I'm going to do instead? Or were you just pinning all your hopes on getting Australian citizenship eventually?
The plan B was go back to Pakistan. There's no backup places that you can go. It's not like, if you don't go to Australia, you can end up in Papua New Guinea. That's not, I guess it is technically, that is the plan B for most people who are refugees and asylum seekers. But no, for us, it was basically until we got permanent residency, we always kept enough money in our bank account to buy tickets back to Pakistan if we need to just leave. So that was always the kind of the plan B, was just go back where we came from, to use that catchphrase.
Looking back now that the process is well and truly finished, was it hard? Do you think it was a hard process, or was it more time consuming?
The hardest part is getting that Australian visa, the permanent residency visa or the temporary resident visa, when you're not in Australia, when you're from a third world country particularly. The amount of paperwork required, the amount of verification of, identity and clearance of your police record and stuff, which a lot of these things are harder to get in developing nations like Pakistan and stuff. The biodata information that they require, the biometrics, some of that can be quite challenging and expensive. That was a difficult thing. We came on a particularly strange visa. We were on a regional state-sponsored visa that said that we had to live for 4 years in a country town in Western Australia before we qualified for permanent residency. As a result, that was a very strange experience. I ended up living in a town called Northam in the middle of nowhere in regional Western Australia. And the end result of that, it was a much harder migration experience, I think, than if we'd just been allowed to live in Melbourne or Sydney right away. But in retrospect, I'm actually a big supporter of that visa, and I think it was the right thing the government did. And I think more people should be put on that visa as opposed to just being given a permanent residency, figure it out. I thought that was a better introduction into Australia in retrospect. It's one of those things when your children are complaining about doing the dishes and you're like, it's character building. Living in a country town in Western Australia for 4 years, it's character building.
Do you think the process is fair? Obviously, that's, a big question, but through your very own experiences, did you feel like it was a fair process? And, looking back at it now, you go, yeah, I understand why I had to jump through that many hoops and satisfy that many different things.
Look, when I was initially going through it definitely didn't feel fair then. It felt very unfair that I had to live in a country town or that the paperwork was so much and things like that. I do see now that I'm able to look back on the whole process. And I don't want to confuse this with the way a lot of migrants like closing the door behind them. I don't like that. It pisses me off when many migrants do this. They come in and then they go, they should make migration harder. It's like, well, then you wouldn't have gotten in either, idiot. But I do think that the level of strictness that Australia applies is appropriate for Australia. In fact, as we've had lots of discussions recently in the news and things about people saying there's too much migration and lots of migration happening, and we need to look at migration numbers, perhaps cap migration numbers because of scarcity of housing, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's a failure of the system being hard enough. The system is very hard. Compared to Canada, US, UK, we've got a much harder migration system. And I think that's fine. I think our issues are the numbers in terms of, how wide open we might be letting people in, stuff like that. But I think it's an appropriate system.
Now, I want to talk about your citizenship ceremony. You were invited to Canberra when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, I believe 2017, to accept your citizenship. Now, from my understanding, you got a little bit of pushback from some of the people in your life. Tell me about that and tell me about the decision to accept your citizenship on Australia Day.
Almost everyone I know who's become a citizen, who is a migrant, it happened on January 26th. In my case, it was a very peculiar set of circumstances. I was working at the ABC at the time. Someone in the immigration department realized that's a good story. It makes us look good. So they flew me to Canberra. And I literally was made a citizen by the Prime Minister himself in a ceremony there in Canberra. Ben Roberts-Smith was in attendance, which, is a crazy lineup if you think, like Malcolm Turnbull, Sami Shah, and Ben Roberts-Smith. And all three of us have been fired in disgrace from our jobs. But the thing that was interesting about it was someone I knew at the time was very upset with me for taking my citizenship on January 26th because she was like, hey, you are being disrespectful to the Indigenous people of Australia. Now, she wasn't Indigenous herself. She was a white person in Melbourne. So take from that what you will. But in fact, both of my Indigenous friends were very happy for me and were celebrating my citizenship because they knew the journey I'd been on to get it. And when I was at the ceremony, receiving my citizenship, she texted me and said, you should be ashamed of yourself for doing this. And this was, of course, from someone who was an Australian citizen, who could take first world country citizenship for granted, not knowing the perils you have to go through to get it when you're from another part of the world. I found that a bit shocking and stuff. But I do understand the complexities of making migrants turn into citizens on the exact same day that is seen as Invasion Day by Indigenous Australians. I completely understand the complexities of that, but I feel like it's unfair to put the onus of that on migrants who've sacrificed a great deal. Migration is not easy. Migration, people think it is. It is not. You sacrifice a lot. You give up friends, family, your home, your homeland, and you come here and you start over. You start from scratch. You lose income and money like crazy. And to go through all of that, you'll take it whatever the day they give it to you. You're not going to be fussy about that. And if you are being fussy about that, you come from a certain place of privilege in being able to be fussy about that, perhaps. But most of us from developing nations don't have that luck. And so if they change Australia Day to some other day, which I personally prefer, I don't like this on January 26th either. But if they do, I think that would be great. But while it is on January 26th, no migrant is going to say, actually, I don't want my citizenship because my white Melburnian friend is offended by my sensibilities now.
So what do you think then of Peter Dutton's election pledge to force councils who have been pulling out of hosting citizenship ceremonies on January 26? Peter Dutton's pledge to force them to do it. Are you in agreement with that, or do you agree with some of the councils that have made the decision to go, oh, we'll do it on the 25th or we'll do it the following week or whenever suits us better?
I do find it always funny when conservative governments who are very big on decreasing the influence of federal government in local decisions, also then the moment they come into power or about to come into power, start making decisions about how federal government should control everything. So either you trust the local councils and whether you like their choices or not, you put up with them because it's not the federal government's business, it's local government's business, or you decide actually where we don't have that kind of division of authority within federal and local levels and the federal government makes all decisions. I think Peter Dutton is wrong. It is up to the individual councils. I can see how some councils think it's the right thing to do, and if majority of the constituents within that council agree with it, fine, absolutely right, their choice. It's the same as changing the name of a local train station or something like that from, an offensive name that might have a very dark history, colonial history, to something more relevant to Indigenous history, for example. So, the federal government doesn't have a say in that, and I don't think it should have a say in this either.
Sami, before we let you go, how do you relate to your citizenship now that it's all said and done?
It's an interesting thing. I've been thinking about this a lot for the last few years. When I do stand-up comedy, I ask other immigrants in the audience, do you feel Australian? And sometimes I do. When my friends in Pakistan or in other parts of the world criticize Australia, I feel very Australian because then you get defensive. It's like, it's that thing of like when they'll say, oh, I heard Australia is like this. And I'm like, no, it's not. Calm down. We're great. Shut up. We're way better than Canada and the US and UK, which we are, on every level. Better food, better wine, better everything. But at the same time, I've also been called un-Australian and not Australian enough and been yelled at in so many different ways for not being a white Australian. When I was on radio, particularly at the ABC, quite notoriously, I was abused constantly by listeners for not being what they thought an Australian should be. So I have a very conflicted relationship with that. I like the fact that Australia is multicultural and someone like me and many other people like me get to call themselves Australian. I'm also very aware of the baggage that being an Australian comes with when it comes to history and politics. But if it's the Australian Open, it's the only one I watch. I don't watch the Wimbledon. I don't watch the US Open. So I guess I'm Australian enough that matters to me. Let me put it that way.
So complicated feelings, I suppose. But overall, you're glad you're here, which we're glad to have you. I'll say it on behalf of white Australians. We're very glad to have you here.
Yeah, no, I'm glad I'm here.
Good. Sami Shah, thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
That was Sami Shah speaking with me there. And that is all for this episode of The Briefing. Thank you so much for joining me. Before you go, I'd love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. Why? Well, it's a really easy way that you can support us and all that we do here at The Briefing so we can keep bringing you these incredible stories. And another way you can help is sharing our posts on social media. We are on TikTok and YouTube. You can search Listener Newsroom. And of course, we are on the gram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you this Arvo for another deep dive.